Some Rome 2 factions are completely broken, others are borderline unplayable. Today we're ranking all 36 based purely on their unit rosters. So, which factions are truly top tier and which ones are holding you back? Now, before we get into it, every single faction here is viable on Legendary. You can win with all of them, and a lot of the weaker ones are actually some of the most fun to play. For the ranking itself, I'm focusing purely on the strength of each faction's roster in the campaign, not the starting position or campaign mechanics, just the units you have access to. First, how strong the roster is across the entire campaign. Some factions are great early but fall off hard, while others start weak but become very powerful later. Second, how strong each part of the roster actually is. Infantry, ranged, cavalry. If a faction is missing a key component or has a major weakness, that matters a lot. Third, flexibility. Does the faction offer varied playstyles, or are you locked into the same tactics every single battle? And finally, whether they have any standout or game-breaking units, things like pikes, elephants, chariots, horse archers, units that can win battles on their own. And just to be clear, this is going to be controversial. Alright, starting with Rome. This faction is an absolute powerhouse. What makes it so strong? To begin with, it has an absolute top tier melee infantry throughout the whole game. Starting with Hastati, already one of the best tier 1 units in the game, Rome very quickly lets you unlock tier 2 units, absolutely brutal Principes and Triarii. Now Principes are beasts. They have enormous melee attack and very good melee defense and armor, and even though they are only tier 2, they actually beat many tier 3 units 1v1. In fact, they are so strong, it's entirely possible to go through whole campaign only with Principes and never upgrade any other units. And then they are often overlooked Triarii, defensive specialists with gigantic melee defense and armor, although with a little bit lackluster attack and weapon damage. They won't score many kills, but they will hold the line for a really long time. They are like massively better version of hoplites. Now, early game, Rome has a couple of weaknesses. Your only ranged units are javelin men equipped velites and levies, which is not ideal, and you start with fairly weak equites as your only cavalry. However, this is where Rome's unique mechanic, auxiliary units, comes in. Essentially, as Rome you can build additional barracks in each province that unlock that province's specific auxiliary units you can recruit. So building auxiliary barracks in Italia, for example, allows you to recruit amazing auxiliary cav, massive upgrade on starting equites, brutal melee cavalry, as well as Socii Extraordinari, who are the best of both worlds, very good defensively and also very serviceable offensively. In fact, once you unlock them, they are a better alternative to Triarii as the main line, while your Principes and Auxiliary Cav absolutely devastate enemies' flanks. And it only gets better once you start expanding outside of Italia. In nearby Gallia, you can get access to excellent auxiliary Gaelic hunters, as well as later on Noble Horse, one of the best melee cavs in the game. And it gets more ridiculous the farther out you expand. Going into Africa, for example, unlocks elephants. And in the Far East, you can even build full stacks of armored horse archers as Rome. So with the best in class melee infantry throughout the whole game, as well as top tier ranged cavalry and also some absolutely broken units like horse archers and elephants, Rome has it all. Absolute god tier. Next we have Carthage. Carthage is interesting. On the surface, its unit roster is uninspiring. You start off with hoplites, peltasts and Carthaginian cav. Decent enough for early game but nothing spectacular. It then takes a while to unlock decent mid-game units in African pikemen and Libyan infantry, as well as early African elephants. However, what sets Carthage apart from every other faction is that it's actually the only faction where it makes sense to also look at mercenaries, because Carthage has them available way cheaper than anyone else in the game, making them actually a valid option from mid-game onwards. This allows Carthage to fill the gaps in. You can easily recruit Balearic slingers anywhere in Africa, making your rage department absolute powerhouse. And once you can afford it, noble fighters are massively better melee infantry than your own crappy Sacred Band elite hoplites, not to mention absolutely devastating Campanian cav, which eclipses Carthage's own noble cav or Carthaginian cav. Top that off with African war elephants and you have a complete roster with some pretty broken units, god tier, although nowhere near as good as Rome. Next we have another of Rome's mortal enemies, Epirus. Now Epirus starts off very strong, with Levy pikes, later upgraded to pikemen, carrying you through early game, and it has access to very interesting unit, Agrarian Axemen, which are a better version of peltasts way better offensively at the cost of a little bit of armor. Top that off with decent early game cav and you have very strong early game. However, major weakness of Epirus' roster is that it falls off hard in mid game. Tier 3 barracks only unlock one useful unit, Thessalian cav. It's very strong, that's true, but this basically means for most of the campaign you will be playing with tier 2 pikemen and axemen and hoplites as your main line. This is not ideal and is outperformed easily by nearby factions. It's only once you unlock elites. Epirus goes back to being a top tier faction, with Hellenic Royal Guard being an amazing pike unit, Royal Peltas being absolutely brutal flankers with amazing melee attack and 3 javelins, as well as some of the best melee and shock infantry in the game. Plus you can even load up on mercenary elephants if you have spare money. However, we can't overlook major weakness, which is very weak mid-game. So it's not quite god tier, but it's very strong still, so ends up in elite. Unlike Epirus, Arverni, the iconic barbarian faction, are extremely strong throughout the whole campaign. Similarly to Rome, they have very good melee infantry. Celtic warriors are probably even better than Hastati, then chosen swords can go head to head with Principes, and Oathsworn are absolute beasts. Gigantic stats and headhunt skill making them one of the absolutely best melee infantry in the game. Not only that, their cavalry is also superior. Mid-game Heavy Horse is one of the best mid-game melee cavs in the game, and Elite Noble Horse is probably second strongest melee cav in the entire game. On top of that, they have access to excellent archers, Gaelic hunters, which have both snipe and guerrilla deployment, making them stay invisible while shooting. The roster is small though, and it doesn't have any game-breaking units, but still Arverni definitely deserve a spot in elite. Alright, next we have Iceni, another Celtic faction, actually very similar to Arverni, but massively worse. Every single unit is weaker than Arverni's alternative, and that's true for both infantry as well as cavalry. On top of that, Iceni don't have access to any archers at all. They have slightly better slingers, equivalent to Eastern slings, with slightly better armor-piercing damage, and they have chariots, as the only barbarian faction. Now those chariots are nowhere near as good as Eastern Scythian chariots, however they can still score hundreds of kills if used well in optimal circumstances. All in all though, Iceni are a little bit underwhelming. It's probably the weakest of all Celtic factions. It's still a strong faction, just not quite as good as Arverni. Alright, this is where things drop off quite a lot actually. Sparta, one of the most iconic factions, unfortunately not one of the most powerful. What Sparta has going for it is absolutely amazing melee infantry, starting off with Spartan hoplites, which are absolutely amazing for tier 2, transitioning in mid-game into Spartan pikemen, again excellent unit for its tier, topped off with Royal Spartans, elite spear unit that can trade evenly even with the best swords in the game. However, it has two major weaknesses, range department and most importantly cavalry. Sparta's range department is essentially the typical Greek roster of archers, slingers, javelin men and peltas. Nothing spectacular, good enough for early game, but not so good in the late game. More worryingly though, Sparta doesn't have access to any good cavalry. All you get is crappy Scythian cav and Tarentine cav. What that means is that you have excellent anvil in form of your pikes and hoplites, but no strong hammer to crush the enemies against it. This means Sparta is destined to fight long grindy melee battles, as you just don't have units that are good at flanking, pushing it into fairly one-dimensional combat. Still, having very good melee infantry makes it a decent faction overall. Alright, next we have Athens. Athens' roster actually addresses Sparta's main weakness, lack of any good cavalry. It's actually fairly similar roster to Spartans. Melee infantry made of hoplites and pikes, not quite as good as Spartans, but still pretty decent. Very similar range department with archers, peltas and slingers. However, Athens do have access to elite cavalry, Hippeus lancers. It's not the best elite cavalry in the game, but it's way better than crappy Scythian cav, making an actual hammer and anvil strategy possible. So essentially, compared to Sparta, you lose a little bit in terms of melee infantry, but you gain invaluable elite cavalry. In my opinion, Athenians' roster is just better and more balanced. They are strong. Now Syracuse actually has exactly the same roster, and these are the only two factions in the game that are similar to the letter. The only slight edge Syracuse have over Athens is that they have access to slightly better mercs. Alright, next we have another powerhouse, and this is a really interesting one, Parthia. Parthia has one of the absolutely best cavalry department in the game, starting with all tiers of horse archers, as well as brutal shock cav in form of royal cataphracts, topped off with absolutely brutal Indian elephants. It also has extremely good range department, with Eastern slings and javelin men being better versions of the Greek ones, as well as elite Persian archers and Parthian foot archers. But where it falls off hard is melee infantry department. Early game is weak because all you have is Eastern spears and hillmen, which you can then replace with Persian hoplites. These are another very weak unit, massively worse than Greek hoplites. It's not until later in mid-game where you unlock Parthian swordsmen, which are essentially equivalent to thorax swords, the only decent frontline unit Parthia has access to. So all in all, excellent units in cavalry and range department, but relatively weak melee department. I mean, it's not quite god tier. It's got horse archers and elephants, but we can't justify not having a strong front line, meaning we put it in elite. Parthia is stronger than Arverni though, but not quite as good as Epirus. Alright, next we have Suebi. Now this faction is weird. It has some of the most bizarre units in the game, and it's not that strong either. The early game is very challenging because club levies and spear levies, your early game units, are very weak defensively, meaning they take horrific casualties in every battle. Tier 2 round shield swords are not much better, again, very weak in terms of armor and melee defense. It's only once you unlock mid tiers with wooden spears and spear wall, things get interesting as you finally have a strong front line to protect your excellent longbow hunters and to buy them enough time to actually deal some damage. In terms of cavalry, it's not spectacular. You have Riders of the Hunt in mid-game and Noble Riders in late game, however these are just weaker versions of Celtic units. You do get very decent elite melee infantry in Swordmasters. These are actually pretty close to awesome power level. And then Suebi also have some gimmicky units like Berserkers and Bloodsworn. They are excellent shock troops, but very vulnerable to anything really, especially cavalry charges and ranged units because they have barely any armor. They are difficult to use and generally it's better to just flank with your cavalry. So how do they compare? They are weaker than Arverni for sure, and probably weaker than Iceni too. They are still a strong faction, as just early game is a challenge, and their units in general are just weaker versions of Celtic units. Going to put them in strong. Alright, next we have Boii. This faction is interesting. It's actually very similar to Arverni, however it's actually much stronger in the mid-game. Sword followers and veteran spears are better than Arverni's alternative, however where Boii are actually weaker is range department. Their Celtic bows are massively inferior to Arverni's Gaelic hunters. So essentially, these are two very similar factions, as just Boii are stronger in mid-game, while Arverni have better archers. Which one you place higher entirely depends whether you're going to spend more time in mid-game or late game. Boii also lack elite spears, however once you unlock Oathsworn, there's no reason to hire elite spears anyway. Overall, I think Arverni are slightly better. Once you have Oathsworn, you no longer care about mid-tier units, and Gaelic hunters give you that extra edge. Okay, next we have Nervii, another Celtic faction that's very similar to Boii and Arverni, although with one massive weakness. It's actually very weak mid-game. Unlike Arverni's chosen swords and Boii's sword followers, Nervii's fierce swords are actually massively weaker, and they don't have any spear infantry other than the early game one. They get better late game as they also have access to noble horse and Oathsworn, but the big massive gap in mid-game power level makes them at best strong. I would still say they are stronger than Suebi because of their superior early and late game, even if they are slightly weaker in mid-game. Alright, this is where things get strong again. Macedon, one of the 4 successor kingdoms. Very strong faction throughout the game. Most importantly, Macedon has access to pikes at all tiers, starting with levy pikemen all the way to elite foot companions. It also has excellent sword units, thorax swords at mid tier and absolutely brutal elites in royal peltasts, as well as some of the best non-Eastern cavalry in the game. Excellent shock cav in companion cav, melee cav in Aspis companion cav, and wide range of ranged units, including archers, agrarian axemen, slingers and peltasts. All in all, very strong faction, however not quite in the same league as Carthage because it doesn't have any game-breaking units and it only has basic skirmishers. It is stronger than Epirus because of better mid-game with thorax swords and thorax spikes, which Epirus doesn't have access to, and equally good early and late game. So Macedon ends up at the top of elite tier. Alright, next we have Pontus. This faction is really interesting. Its unit roster is a mixture of Hellenic and Eastern factions, and it's absurdly strong in early game. At tier 2 they have access to pikemen, Pontic swords, which are more like tier 3 power level, Eastern archers, Pontic peltas with devastating missile damage, as well as Cappadocian cav, which is absurdly strong for tier 2 unit. In fact, it's a tier 2 cavalry that beats most tier 3 cavs easily enough, and on top of everything, it's a faction that unlocks Scythian chariots the fastest of all of them, within the first dozen or so turns. This makes them absolutely ridiculous in early game, and if we were only ranking the early part of the campaign, they would be sitting here, even before Rome. Things fall off hard for Pontus though. In mid-game, they get absolutely nothing useful, which is not a catastrophe because their ridiculous early game units are still strong enough to carry you through mid-game, and in late game, they get decent enough elite cavalry as well as elite pikes. Those pikes, however, bronze shield pikemen, are a total opposite of their early game units, which punch way above their weight. Bronze shield pikes are actually crap for elites. They are more like African pikemen or Spartan pikes. Good enough for high mid tier but not really elite power level. All in all, it's still a strong unit roster, absurdly strong in early game, but falling off after. They still do have two game-breaking units, pikemen and Scythian chariots, so I'm going to place them at the very bottom of strong tier. Okay, next we have Colchis. I often wonder why this faction even exists. It's another one that's a mixture of Greek and Eastern roster, but it gets the worst of both worlds. Its infantry is made of Greek hoplites and Eastern axemen. It has basic Eastern ranged units, which are slightly better than Greek equivalents, and the cavalry department is made of basic horse archers without armor, Greek Hippeus lancers and Eastern noble blood cav. All in all, they are just about decent in all departments, but there's nothing spectacular about them. There's not a single unit you'd be looking forward to. They get neither the best of what Greeks have to offer, i.e. pikes, nor the best of East has to offer, like elite cavalry or armored horse archers, or elephants. All in all, very underwhelming faction. It's not exactly crap, it's just enough to stay at decent, but just barely. Not far away from Colchis is Armenia, and this is where things get really interesting, because Armenia is a powerhouse. It has similar issues with infantry to Colchis, with axemen being their best frontline units, but it has absolutely absurd cavalry, with all tiers of horse archers, as well as some of the absolutely best elite cav in the game, with royal cataphracts, the best shock cav in the game, and Azat knights, the best melee cav in the game. On top of that, they have very decent range department, including elite Persian archers. All in all, weak infantry but absurdly strong cavalry, and very good range department. Now, what's important here is that Armenia actually allows for a few different playstyles. The axes they have access to are just good enough to hold the line, which means you can use them as anvil, and your cataphracts can be the hammer. Or you can just build full stacks of armored horse archers and use AI's inability to deal with them to carry you through the whole campaign. Or you can do combined arms armies, also loading up on archers and mixing all the unit types. Overall, Armenia belongs to the elite, although probably towards the very bottom because of how weak the melee section is. Alright, next we have Lusitani. I'll be blunt here, Lusitani are crap. They start the campaign week and they end the campaign week. The main fatal flaw of Lusitani is that their melee infantry has very little armor, which means they take massive losses every single battle. Yes, they have great attack and great charge bonus, but that doesn't compensate for very poor armor. On top of that, their cavalry section is very underwhelming. Their best cav is mid-tier Scutari cav, and they have no access to elite cav at all. Range department is somewhat better, they have access to excellent Balearic slingers fairly early in the campaign, but the problem here is that Balearic slingers don't exactly work with Lusitani melee infantry. What you want from your melee infantry when you're playing slingers is to hold the line for really long. You want long grindy battles that are long enough for slingers to be able to use all their 25 ammo, whereas Lusitani melee infantry is actually suited for short brutal engagements because of big melee attack and weapon damage and low armor. So these two don't really work together very well. It's a fairly weak roster that's also mismatched. They belong in the crap tier. Alright, next we have another Iberian faction, Averaci. These guys are so much better than crappy Lusitani, it's not even close. First of all, their early game infantry, Scutari, are miles better than anything Lusitani have. They have massive melee attack, defense and armor, making them one of the absolutely best tier 2 units in the game. And it only gets better from there, because their elites, noble fighters, are actually pretty much at awesome power level, vastly superior to Lusitani nobles. On top of that, they have access to excellent noble cavalry, which again is pretty similar to Arverni's noble horse. They also have Balearic slingers, just as Lusitani, however they are able to use them better because of their melee infantry being better defensively, and they even have some gimmicky units such as painted warriors with scare ability and guerrilla warriors with guerrilla deployment. Overall, Averaci belong to elite, excellent infantry, excellent cavalry and excellent range department throughout the whole game. I'm going to put them ahead of Armenia, however behind Boii and Arverni, because as much as they are great, they are not quite as strong as the Celtic factions. Alright, next we have Egypt, an absolute powerhouse. Egypt is ridiculously strong. It has everything. It's a top tier faction throughout the whole campaign in every unit department. Not only it has all 4 tiers of pikes, including Hellenic Royal Guard elite pikes, which are arguably the best pikes in the game, but also, unlike other Greek factions, it has excellent sword department, starting with Galatian swords in early game, through thorax swords in mid game, all the way to royal peltasts, royal thorax swords, and absolutely ridiculous Galatian royal guard. Now, even Galatia doesn't have a unit like that. This unit is absurdly strong. It's essentially awesome power level unit available to Greek faction that already has everything else it needs. One of the absolutely best sword units in the game. Not only that, Egypt's mounted department is absolutely ridiculous. African war elephants, Scythian chariots, excellent Ptolemaic shock cav, and camel archers. Not only it has probably the largest and most varied roster in the game, but also you can play multiple different playstyles. You can play defensively with a front line of pikes, you can play offensively with Egypt's excellent swords. In either case, you can have your flanks secured by brutal elephants, chariots and shock cav, or you can just build full stacks of camel archers. Egypt goes right into S tier. It's absolutely amazing, it has no weaknesses, maybe other than fairly generic range department, but it's so absurdly strong in infantry and cavalry that it belongs at the very top of the god tier. Yes, it's better than Rome. Alright, next we have Getae. Getae is not for the faint-hearted. This faction is absolutely brutal in terms of how difficult the early game is. Their basic spears are absolute crap, one of the worst units in the game, and the upgraded spear warriors at tier 1 are not much better. They do get basic bows, skirmishers and cavalry at tier 2, however with how weak their frontline is, it actually is pretty difficult to use the other units to their full extent anyway. Now, their mid-game is actually pretty crappy too. You need to go all the way to infantry chainmail to get better units, as that tech allows you to upgrade your spears and spear warriors to heavy spears and armored spears. Now these are way better, both defensively and offensively, although they are still only somewhat better than hoplites. But at least you now have the main line that's able to hold the line in prolonged melee. The same tech allows Getae to upgrade their bows and skirmishers to the heavy version, giving them both way better armor, as well as somewhat better melee stats. Now where Getae truly shine is the elites. Noble swords are excellent, not quite as good as Osworn, but not far off either. And they also get elite shock cavalry, very good one as well. This makes them the only barbarian faction with heavy bows, heavy skirmishers, elite shock cav, and horse archers. Yes, they do have horse archers, which is essentially get out of a jail card for them. If in early game you struggle too much fighting the usual combined arms playstyle, you can just build a full stack of horse archers and win that way. Overall though, they are pretty much the opposite of Pontus, who starts strong and then gets weaker as the campaign progresses. However, they climb out of that mess through mid game and are actually pretty powerful late game. If we were only ranking late game, they might even make it all the way to elites, because they are at least comparable with Boii and Arverni, if not slightly better because of their better range department and shock cav. However, considering how weak their early game and how underwhelming their mid game is, they are strong at best, and also probably towards the bottom of the tier. Odrysian Kingdom. This faction is absolute crap. Not only does it have very limited unit roster, but also the units don't work together at all. It's a worse version of Lusitani. Their line infantry is the crappy spears, the same unit as Getae have, but they get nothing else throughout the whole campaign. They do have shock infantry, and they have okay peltas, but the problem is, both shock infantry and skirmishers require a strong line of melee infantry to hold enemy in place while you flank and destroy them. Odrysians don't have that, and as good as Thracian nobles are, with very weak melee defense and armor, they are a prey for ranged units, and once the charge bonus is off, they actually lose even to mid tiers in prolonged melee. Not to mention, you only get them very late in the campaign. Earlier on, you need to rely on skirmishers. They also have fairly limited cavalry section. Their elite cav is pretty decent and has precursor javelins, but all in all, the roster is just crap. The units are weak individually and they don't make any cohesive whole. It's a crap tier, even worse than Lusitani because of lack of any sort of decent melee infantry. Alright, next we have Cymmeria. This is another hybrid faction. It's a little bit similar to Colchis, but it's more of a Greek nomadic hybrid rather than Greek Eastern hybrid. Now, it has some spectacular units, it has excellent archers, even their early game step archers are amazing, and Cimmerian heavy archers are arguably the best archers in the game. It also has access to excellent horse archers, including armored ones. But there are two big gaps in Cimmerian's roster. Firstly, it lacks any strong melee infantry. All it has early game are crappy hoplites, replaced late game by Cimmerian noble infantry, which for elite is very underwhelming, and it lacks any serious non-horse archer cavalry. It kinda forces you into skirmishing playstyle. It is stronger than Colchis. Even though it has weaker melee units, it has way better archers and horse archers, but it's still only a decent faction. It feels like it's one strong unit away from being really strong, but unfortunately it's stuck here, in the mediocre tier. In a spirit of hybrids, we have Massilia. I'll be blunt, this faction is crap. This time we have a Greek-Celtic hybrid, but similarly to Colchis, it gets the worst of both worlds. The Celtic units Massilia has access to are all low tiers, and yes, Celtic warriors are great in the early game, but they fall off pretty quickly, and the price Massilia pays for access to those Celtic units is very steep because it lacks all the best Greek units. It has no access to pikes at all, only generic hoplites, Sitzenkav, and in mid-game, thorax swords and Massalian hoplites. So after a fairly strong early game thanks to Celtic warriors, their mid-game is actually pretty underwhelming. They do get Massalian cav, however it's pretty crappy, probably even worse than ordinary Sitzenkav. And the only elite unit Massilia gets are typical Greek Hippeus lancers. So you end up with a roster that's pretty strong in the early game, but by late game, all you have is a front line of thorax swords, flanked by Hippeus lancers, probably the weakest of all the Greek factions. Crap tier. Not as bad as Odrysians though, but weaker than Lusitani. Alright, next we have Baktria, an absolute powerhouse. One of the successor kingdoms that's actually worth its name. Baktria is amazing. It's extremely strong throughout the whole campaign. It has 3 tiers of pikes, lacking only elites, as well as thorax swords, making their melee infantry department really strong, but where it really shines is ranged and most importantly cavalry. They have all tiers of horse archers including elites, as well as ridiculously strong Hellenic cataphracts. On top of that, Aegean elephants, absolute beasts. The range department is also very strong with elite Persian archers and brutal Bactrian peltasts. Very well-rounded roster all around, with the only weakness being lack of elite melee infantry, but that is more than compensated by the best elephants in the game, brutal horse archers, excellent shock cav, and amazing ranged units. Baktria belongs to S tier. It's actually better than Carthage because of better elephants and better cavalry and horse archers, even though it slightly lacks in infantry. Alright, next we have 3 nomadic factions, Massagetae, Roxolani and real Scythians. Now, I'm going to treat these factions the same and they deserve tier of their own. They belong to weird tier. The reason is simple, they are extremely one-dimensional. As nomadic factions, all they have is cavalry. Their only infantry are basic young axes, which are no good for anything really, and being cavalry-only armies, you don't want to include crappy basic infantry just to slow you down, as you lose the bonus movement from having only mounted units. Now, being cavalry only means you have horrible time assaulting cities, you need to starve the defenders out or bring enough to auto-resolve, which is not always possible. Yes, they all have excellent horse archers and some of the best shock cavalry in the game, but they are just too one-dimensional. If you enjoy horse archer playstyle, they are the factions for you, but if you don't, they don't really have anything else to offer. Now in terms of which of them is the most powerful, probably Royal Scythians. The other two only have horse archers and shock cav. Scythians also have elite horse skirmishers and mid-tier melee cav, making them the most varied of the three. Make no mistake though, these factions are still extremely strong. Full stack of horse archers is basically impossible for AI to beat, so you can easily win the campaign with just armored horse archers with any of these three factions, and it will be a breeze. However, the battles will be very repetitive, and unlike with other factions that have horse archers like Armenia, Baktria or even Getae, these guys offer nothing, no alternatives whatsoever. That's why they belong to weird tier. Alright, let's have a look at Nabataea. This faction is really interesting. It's one of the crappy early game factions that just gets better and better as the game progresses. Early game is absolutely brutal though, your crappy desert troops are hopelessly bad, stats wise, and have low morale on top of that, making them break very easily. You start to get better stuff towards the later stages of mid game, once you unlock Nabataean thorax spikes and desert hoplites, but where this faction truly shines is late game. Desert Hellenic Cataphracts, Rakim Palace Guard, absurdly strong defensive unit with the highest armor in the game, Nabataean heavy archers, and Scythed chariots on top of that. Absolutely brutal, excellent elite units in every department. Not only that, they also have camel archers, allowing for alternative playstyle where you just build full stack of these guys and own everything. If we were only ranking late game, they would belong to elites, and pretty high too, but they're absolute crap in early game, which means we need to mark them down. Going to place them ahead of Getae because they have massively better units in every department other than melee infantry. And in the spirit of Desert Kingdoms we have Kush. Now Kush is ridiculously powerful, it's like Nabataea on steroids. It starts pretty crappy with Nubian spears and slave infantry, but once you unlock your mid tiers, it's a whole different game. Shotel warriors are amazing sword unit with ridiculous 12 armor piercing damage and very good armor. They basically shred through anything in mid game, especially when you have pikes to hold the line and elephants on flanks. On top of that, very decent Kushite archers. Mid game is amazing for Kush, and it gets even better in late game. Armored Shotel warriors are preposterous. It shreds anything to pieces that's not an elephant, even beating easily Oathsworn and Roman elite units. Not only that, two more game-breaking units, African War Elephants and Scythed Chariots, are what awaits you in late game, on top of Royal Kushite Archers, one of the best archers in the game. Absolutely amazing units in every unit department. Ridiculously strong faction, S tier. We need to mark them down slightly for weak early game, but they are still better than Baktria and Carthage. They are actually probably the strongest faction in late game of them all, God tier. Next Ardiaei, and we fall all the way down from God tier to crap pile. These guys are useless. They start with typically crappy spear infantry of Balkan factions. They do get slightly better as the campaign progresses, but nowhere near as good as the other factions that actually spread their wings from mid-game onwards. Ardiaei are just consistently crappy. They do have decent hoplites at tier 3 and 4, however they are still worse than Greek hoplites. But their main flaws are lack of any decent cavalry. Their best cav is weaker than even crappy citizen cav, and their long-range missile units, slave slingers, not only are crappy but also very difficult to unlock. They have valid alternative, their own version of 3 spears and marines with multiple javelins, decent enough but still massively lack long-ranged missile units, and their playstyle is actually fairly similar to Sparta's, where you need to rely on big massive hoplites to grind the enemies down, because you don't have any decent cavalry and only fairly generic ranged units. However, they are massively worse than Sparta. Their crappy hoplites are nowhere near as good as Royal Spartans. They belong in a crap pile, but probably they are the best of the bunch, because their elite hoplites, once you build proving grounds, are actually half decent. Still, it's a crap pile nonetheless. Alright, next Telis, another Balkan faction. Telis couldn't be more different than crappy Ardiaei. They are a powerhouse. They share quite a lot of the same units with other Celtic factions, Arverni, Boii and the likes. However, what sets them apart is tribal warriors. absolutely ridiculous tier 3 melee infantry. These guys are beasts. They have ridiculous armor, ridiculous melee defense, and still very good attack and weapon damage. Probably the second strongest tier 3 infantry after shuttle warriors. You don't even need Oathsworn to win the campaign with these guys, they're absolute brutes. But this is not only about mid-game. Celtic warriors carry you through early game easily enough, and obviously Oathsworn are absolute top tier late game. They are not without weaknesses though. They have very limited range department with just the basic Celtic units, no archers, just slings and javelins. And their cavalry, even though they get noble horse for elites, lacks any serious mid-game cav. So overall they are weaker than Arverni and Boii, because tribal warriors alone are not enough to compensate for lack of archers and good mid-tier cav, but they still belong to elite. Alright, and the last Celtic unit, Galatia. For some reason Galatian people decided to settle in the middle of Anatolia, and they forgot to bring Oathsworn. They are the only Celtic faction with no elite infantry, and it hurts them badly. They do have excellent Galatian swords, which are strong enough to easily carry them through early game, and they have one of the best tier 3 units, Galatian legionaries. Not as good as shuttles or tribal warriors, but pretty close, and better than pretty much anything else other than maybe Roman infantry. However, they also have very generic range department with just the basic Celtic units and no archers, but they also lack any serious cavalry all the way to elites, where they do get noble horse, so it's not all bad, but there are some glaring holes. No elite infantry and weak range department and lack of mid-tier cavalry makes them strong at best. Now, where would I place them? Definitely behind Suebi. Suebi do have swordmasters after all, and are just better late game. Galatia is a powerhouse mid game and early game, but they are pretty similar to Pontus. Even Pontus though is better, they also get elite cav, but also elite pikes. Overall, this is probably where they belong, between Suebi and Pontus. Alright, next we have Pergamon. Pergamon is slightly better Massilia. It's still an awkward faction that tries to mix Greek units with Celtic ones, but it just does it better. Not only are Galatian swords way better than Celtic warriors for early game, but Pergamon also gets to keep Greek pikes, unlike Massilia, which means their early game is absolute breeze. Frontline of pikes flanked with Galatian swords and light horse makes them better than anyone around them, but where Pergamon falls off hard is mid-game. They get no decent mid-game units at all, so crappy pikes and swords, which are maybe great on turn 20 but not so good on turn 40, have to do. It does get better once you unlock elites, with their Pergamonese noble cav being actually pretty decent, although fairly weak compared to other elite Hellenic cavs, but they do also get picked peltasts, so the range department is actually having a massive power spike at late game. And finally, they also get elite infantry, Agema spears, finally something to hold the line. Although this unit is extremely awkward, it's essentially hoplite with 5 javelins. Now here's the problem with this guy. 5 javelins sound great on paper, but if you make them your front line, they are only going to throw 1, maximum 2 before the lines clash, which basically means you're fighting with hoplites as your main line, but paying for them as for elites. And if you want to flank with them, there are better alternatives, because their offensive stats are just not that great. Yes, they have javelins, but they are competing for the same spot on flanks with picked peltasts and elite shock cav. This unit is just too awkward to be used effectively in a campaign. Overall though, Pergamon is probably one of the weakest strong factions. They have excellent early game, decent late game, but just a glaring hole in the mid game, where they are probably one of the weaker factions. Alright, next we have Massagetae, another desert faction. This one is ridiculously weak early game. Their slave infantry and crappy desert spears are absolutely hopeless, especially that their surrounding enemies are much stronger. In fact, they have no good infantry all the way to very late game, where you unlock desert legionaries and desert cohorts. Only then you finally have strong enough frontline to compete with pretty much anyone. They also have fairly weak desert ranged troops until mid game, where you get heavy skirmishers, but where they truly shine is the cavalry department. They have very nice selection of all sorts of cavalry, mainly skirmishing cav, at all tiers, as well as African elephants and desert chariots. Their chariots are crappy, but they are still chariots nonetheless. So they do get massively better as the campaign progresses, but because of how weak they are in early game, they don't deserve anything better than decent tier. Alright, next we have Saba, the final desert faction. Their early game and mid game is utter joke, their melee units are absolute crap, Spears lack attack and weapon damage and swords are weak all around. And their noble swords are utter joke. Elite unit of 45 armor is just ridiculous. However, there is a big payoff if you stick with them throughout the campaign, as for elites they actually get some really decent stuff. Marib Royal Guard is very decent defensive spear, finally at the very end of the campaign, and they also get absolute brutes, camel cataphracts. These guys are absolutely devastating. However, with overall weak infantry, and even their elite spears being worse than elite hoplites, and fairly basic range department, they don't deserve anything better than decent. They are competent though. Probably the closest comparison is Sparta. They have also big defensive elite units, just like Royal Spartans, just much worse, but their cavalry is way better than Spartans. And they have probably roughly similar range department. So Saba goes to the top of a decent tier. And finally, the true gods of Rome 2, Seleucid Empire. These guys have absolutely everything. They are preposterous. 4 tiers of pikes, securing campaign at all stages. Amazing sword units, including Royal Peltasts and Silver Shield swords. They even have elite hoplites, although a little bit underwhelming. Range department is amazing, with Syrian heavy archers being one of the absolutely best archers in the game, and their cavalry is just on a different level. Azat Knights and Hellenic Cataphracts are top tier, and they have the best elephants in the game, Indian armored elephants, as well as scythed chariots. Oh, and if you don't like combined arms armies, you can also build a full stack of camel archers. The best roster in the game, the most diverse, excellent at every stage of the campaign with every unit department, and they are one of the very few factions that have all 4 game-breaking units: pikes, elephants, chariots and mounted archers. God tier, best in game, absolute brutes, devastators, Seleucid Empire. Let me know in the comments if you agree with these rankings, and if not, let me know why. And subscribe!